Moving along now through our letters to the churches in Revelation chapter 2, we come to the church in Smyrna. And that message to that church says, beginning in verse 8 of chapter 2, "To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death." So, in this letter, first of all, Jesus identifies himself as the one who is the first and the last. That is reminiscent of the title Alpha and Omega that the Lord calls himself in verse 8 of chapter 1, but also Jesus makes the point to call himself the first and the last in chapter 1, verse 17. That's one of the reasons that Jesus tells us to not be afraid. He specifically told John that, and through telling John tells us, we don't need to be afraid because he is the first and the last. And as was noted when we discussed that portion from chapter 1, first and last is a reference to his eternality. Jesus has always been and always will be. He is present before our struggles and will endure beyond the end of our struggles. He is the parentheses of all of our experience, ensuring that every part of our life is seen and guarded by the God that loves us. Jesus has no end, and he is on our side, and he is always there to be with us. He also reminds us, just like he did in chapter 1, verse 18, that he is alive, that he is the one who died, like all of us will one day, but came alive again. Which, were it not for Jesus, that wasn't going to happen. But Jesus made a way for us to conquer death through him. So he reminds us again of why we don't need to be afraid. Death is not the final save for us because of Jesus and what he did in conquering death. Jesus reminds the Smyrnans that he knows the difficulties that they're going through. He knows their affliction. He knows their poverty. But then he marks, you feel poor. Materially, you are poor. I know your poverty, yet you are rich. Jesus challenges the Smyrnans, and through challenging them, challenges us to remember that heaven has a different currency than here on earth. Here on earth, when people lack certain resources and opportunities, we view them as being poor. And in reality, they are. They lack resources that make their life easier. They lack opportunities to give themselves better lives. But the currency of heaven is rooted in the blessing of God. And Jesus reminds us of this all through his ministry, but especially in the Sermon on the Mount, when he tells us that the poor in spirit are blessed. It says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Luke is a little bit more pointed in his version of the Beatitudes. He says, "Blessed are the poor." Those who are in poverty are truly the ones who are blessed because we will receive God's kingdom. Riches are not measured by what we have on this earth, things that will rust and be destroyed and will perish with time, things that we cannot take with us beyond the grave. Riches are rooted in our connection to Jesus Christ, the only one who can reward us beyond this life. Like Jesus tells us in the Gospels, we need to be careful to store up treasures for ourselves in heaven, where rust cannot eat and the moth cannot destroy. Where are we placing our emphasis? And Jesus lets them know he knows their life on this world is hard there in Smyrna, but he wants them to know that his eye is on them. And in reality, although they're poor by this world's standards, by his standard, which is the only one that matters, they are in fact rich. He knows that they're being slandered. Now there's this interesting phrase here. The ones slandering them are those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. This is a reference to those ethnic Jews who deny the message of Jesus Christ. They claim to be Jews because they read the Old Testament scriptures, the Torah. They live lives that are kosher in keeping in line with the law of God, but they have rejected Israel's Messiah. They did not truly know Israel's God because when he visits them in the person of Jesus Christ, they didn't even recognize him. So Jesus makes the point. They claim to be Jews. They claim knowledge of the scriptures. They claim to live in continuity of the ministries of Abraham and Elijah and are waiting the Messianic king that would sit on the throne of David. They claim to be Jews, but in reality they are not, because when Jesus comes to them as the one who fulfills the ministries of Moses and of Elijah and of King David's descendant who would sit on the throne, they didn't even recognize him. They are not true Jews, but in reality are a synagogue of Satan. Now, the word Satan, we use it as a title, and that's what it is. It's a descriptor. It's not a proper name. It's not as if the devil's proper name is Satan. Rather, this is a title describing his nature, and it means the adversary, the deceiver. And these Jews belong to the synagogue, not of God, but of Satan, because they are accusing and making life miserable for the true Jews. That is, those who have accepted the rule and the priesthood of Israel's Messiah, Jesus. This is a theme we'll talk about probably throughout this book off and on. I don't want to spend a long time belaboring the point, but in short, what we have to realize is that when it comes to identifying Israel, the identity marker of a true Jew is not ethnicity, rather it is faithfulness to Israel's God. We see this at play even in the Old Testament era. Of course, it was the physical, genetic descendants of Abraham who are the Jews and who receive covenant and promise. But all along the way, there were those who belonged to the ethnic race of Jews and were part of the general covenant community that did not receive the blessings of the covenant because they did not combine their calling with faith. They did not live it out. There was always a righteous remnant within the nation of Israel that faithfully responded to God, that truly knew and loved God. I want to just use an illustration from a period of Israelite history that we can read about in the books of the Kings, specifically in 1 Kings, during the reign of King Ahab, who was an ethnic Jew, genealogically could be traced back to Abraham. He marries a pagan Gentile woman named Jezebel. And during that period of Israelite history, there was a lot of persecution against those that followed the Lord, who refused to worship the idols that Jezebel had introduced. And there was a lot of compromise on the part of most of the Jews of that day. Now, what we come to find out is that God sent the prophet Elijah to call Israel to evaluate their place, to ask themselves, we have been given promises as Israel, but are we living them out? Are we really truly fulfilling the calling of what it means to be an Israelite? And the answer for most of them was no. So Elijah, by prompting of the word of God, challenges false prophets who worship the god Baal to a showdown on top of Mount Carmel, where the true God would respond by calling fire down to consume a sacrifice. And to set this whole thing up, Elijah makes the point to all the Israelites that are hearing. He said that they needed to stop wavering between two opinions. Either God's God or he's not God. And they had to wrestle with whether or not they would follow him. Would they claim God as their God, or would they go the way of Ahab and Jezebel, denying the calling that God had laid before them? So we know how the whole contest went down. God wins. He responds by fire. The priests of Baal are humiliated, and then they are judged and killed. And the people are amazed, and there is some turning back to God. But then Jezebel's angry and begins persecuting the prophets of the Lord, and Elijah flees and he goes into the wilderness. And while he is there, he is feeling pretty down. He's feeling lonely, and he believes, and he tells God this while he's there. He said, they're killing the Lord's prophets, and I'm the only one left. There's nobody left but me. I'm the only one that cares and the only one listening in all of Israel. And God makes the point. He said, no, there are other prophets that I have reserved for myself who have never bent the knee to Baal. God reminds Elijah that although the entire nation looks like a failed project, nobody's following the Lord, nobody's listening, the people are lukewarm at best. Sure, there was kind of a half-hearted turning back after the showdown on top of Carmel. Elijah felt alone, but God said there is a remnant. There's a group of real prophets, real Jews who have never worshiped another God. And that idea of a faithful remnant in the midst of the unfaithful nation is something that carries all through the Old Testament. True Israel, then, is the group within Israel that acknowledges and accepts God as the Lord, as their rescuer, and as their redeemer. Paul makes this same point in his letter to the Romans. He writes, this is in Romans chapter 2, beginning in verse 28. It says, a man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. So Paul, in the New Covenant era, makes this point, that a Jew is not a Jew simply because of ethnicity. A true Jew is one who is a Jew inwardly. That is, one who doesn't just bear the marks on their body, but whose heart, the inside, is in a place of service and obedience and worship to God. And their heart is marked by this love and faith for God. Later in Romans, in chapter 9, Paul's discussing God's sovereignty and God's freedom to choose who and what group it is that he will work with and through to bring salvation to the world. And he's discussing, in chapter 9 specifically, about what right God has to bring Gentiles into Israel and call them Israel. And God begins explaining this whole thing about, look, it's my choice. He is explaining through Paul that God has a sovereign choice to choose who he will work through and how he will work through them to accomplish his purposes. And in that whole discussion, he, in verse 6 of chapter 9, says something that's relevant to this idea of what makes a Jew a true Jew. 9:6, it says, it is not as though God's word had failed, for not all who are descendant from Israel are Israel, nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. In other words, it is not the natural children who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. So the point is made, just like back in the day when Abraham had Ishmael and Isaac, it wasn't simply being a descendant of Abraham that made a person a Jew. It was the line that was elected and chosen to represent God to the nations. That was Isaac. And that's relevant because it reminds us that being a flesh and blood descendant of Abraham is not the qualification for being a true Israelite. It is being a child of the promise. And what we find through the Bible is as we read it, that it is possible for Jews and Gentiles together to be part of Abraham's offspring through faith. So that's a discussion that will probably unfold as we move on, the relationship between Israel and the church. But relevant to our discussion right now, well, we have to understand that not all Israel is Israel. Just because they're an ethnic Jew does not make them Israel. And that's the point that is being made in this part of Revelation. The letter written to Smyrna reminds them that there are those who are ethnic Jews that have missed the boat as far as the Messiah is concerned, and instead of belonging to the community of Israel, they are not children of the promise. They do not cling to the promises that are offered through Jesus Christ. So they're not part of God's community. Instead, they are part of Satan's community. Now, a little bit more background to give some understanding to that phrase, a synagogue of Satan. The Roman Empire had a policy where they did, in fact, allow other religions to be practiced that were not necessarily tied into the traditional Roman mythologies and religions. Judaism was a permitted religion. The Jews were allowed to practice their faith, to pray, to worship, to read scriptures, to assemble together. What they were not permitted to do, though, was proselytize. They could not make converts. And if it were found that they were making converts, well, they would lose their status and their freedom to gather, and they would be penalized. So in the early Christian movement, the Christians did not name themselves as a group distinct from the Jews. Their claim all along was that they were Jews who recognized the coming of the Jewish Messiah. The apostles claimed that the Jewish nation reached its climax and fulfillment in Jesus Christ, and now the community of God, the Israel of God, consisted of believing Jews and Gentiles in the Messiah. That claim and that belief led them to continue their interactions with Jews and to continue and to retain a lot of Jewish practices, and they were indistinguishable from the non-believing Jews. That was a problem for the non-Christian Jews of the time, because you get this group that looks like Jews, uses Jewish language, meets with the Jews, and they are sharing their faith, because sharing the gospel is so intrinsic to the Christian faith. You cannot be a Christian and not be compelled to share your faith. So the non-Christian Jews see these Messianic Jews spreading their faith, knowing that the Romans see no distinction or difference between them, and they become afraid that they are going to lose their privilege, their freedom of worship, and their legitimacy of a religion that can be practiced. And so they begin to go after the Christians, to report them, to remove them from their synagogue rolls, and say, they don't belong here, they're not one of us, they're not really Jews. Well, Jesus flips the table on them, and he says, no. They are the true Israel, because they have taken hold by faith of me, Israel's Messiah. The Jews who are removing them from the synagogue rolls really are not part of God's community in the first place. The synagogue that they have, that they're trying to remove Christians from, is in reality a synagogue of Satan. That is, chasing down Christians and removing them from the rolls and persecuting them by turning them over to Roman authorities so that they can continue their life as normal. So there's a lot of things going on with that phrase, those who say they're Jews but they're not, but are really a synagogue of Satan. Big, long, drawn-out discussion about what that means, but just to recap it shortly, that is a reference to non-Christian Jews who claimed to be God's people and were going after Christians, pushing them out of the synagogues to try to retain their privileges and freedoms as Jews under the Roman system. Jesus tells the Smyrna Christians that he knows what's going on, and he wants them to know that those that are doing that to them are not really Jews. A true Jew is a Jew rooted in the Messiah. The Smyrna Christians represent the true synagogue of God. Jesus sees what they're going through, and he's present with them, and he wants them to know that although times are hard, it's going to be worth it. He tells them about a time of difficulty that's about to come up. He says that the devil will put some of them in prison to test them, and they will suffer persecution for 10 days. That reference to 10 days is just a short, specified period of time. They were going to go through a short period of time where things would be really bad in Smyrna, but Jesus wants them to know that there's going to be hard times, but it's going to be limited. He'll make sure it's limited. And then he encourages them to be faithful even to the point of death, and he will give them the crown of life. Being faithful will be worth it. Your identity and your reward is in Jesus, not the powers that be, not the religious institutions that are rejecting you. Jesus says, I will give you the crown of life. And then again comes the phrase, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not at all be hurt by the second death. Even if you die, you will live. Even if you are killed for your faith, you remain faithful to the point of death. Jesus says that the second death, eternal death, separation from him, will never touch you because you have been faithful, and you will live again. You face death, but you will be given a crown of life. Death will not keep hold on the Christian because it could not keep hold of Jesus, and he imparts that resurrection life to all of his followers. Thank God for that.